And please welcome Kat, co-founder of Shortfinger Brewing and one of the Queen of Craft in the Wellington Breweries organization. Thanks, Graham. Oh.
Thanks.
What did we decide last night?
You and I?
Yeah, what did we decide to talk about last night?
We didn't really decide. We just kind of shot the shit.
Well, that's not really good, is it?
No, the invite that you sent out said that I was going to talk about my experience in the beer industry and starting Shortfinger, so I guess we can do that.
That was the original conversation a long time ago. Yeah.
It was. Yeah, I don't know. So hi, I'm Kat, if we haven't met at Kickoff or elsewhere in the world. Or Shortfinger, I guess, would be the other logical place. I started Shortfinger, which is a homebrew supply shop, beer education center, and mixed fermentation brewery, with my husband Rob in 2015. Our 5th birthday is coming up on June 20th, which is exciting. And I guess we started Shortfinger because Rob's terrible at working for other people. So we figured the best way to avoid that problem would be to start our own thing. But B, having spent at that point about 7 years living and working in Toronto, we were both sort of disillusioned at the time with the beer industry and the beer scene in Toronto. And so we wanted to kind of get out and see what life was like and if the grass was actually greener, because we had talked to some friends that were doing things in smaller places who were saying that it was a little bit just like lower key, which I think was probably a lie, because starting a brewery is not low key. Starting a brewery as a homebrew shop in your basement while you're in the process of gutting and renovating the house that the homebrew shop is in is also not low key. Nor is it low key for you both to quit your jobs and move to a new city in order to do that. So it was a whole thing that we decided to do. That was a lot of fun, but I guess for me, beer for me, I first started working in beer in probably 2012, 2011, 2012. When Rob shifted, originally he was doing logistics for the beer store, and then he went into Great Lakes Brewing Company. And at that point, the company, you are very half naked, don't, and very sweaty. I already told him you were cutting the lawn. At that point, Great Lakes was in a state where it was kind of like, if you work there and you know somebody else, or there's someone else in your family and they're able to donate anytime they have at all. Also now they work at Great Lakes. So even though I was teaching full time, it became my like evening and weekend and summer job. Just sort of like doing events and pop-ups and tap room when they needed it, and helping in the brew house when they needed it, and doing deliveries when they needed it. So it's just like a little bit of everything, but it was mostly events. And I guess one of the things that Bill and I talked about last night was that at the time in like 2011, 2012, the first event that I ever worked for Great Lakes was a festival called Toronto Festival of Beer. Yes, Terry. Yes, Terry. If you have never been to Toronto Festival of Beer, don't go. As I have since learned, it is not a festival for people
The
who
opinions expressed in the show are the opinions of the participant, not necessarily the organization she worked for.
Oh, yeah. This is all right. This is just me. Don't go. It's terrible. Because it's like at the time there weren't a lot of other beer festivals, right? Like this is well before Funk Fest. This is well before Witchstock. This is well before, steam whistles festivals. Like those things didn't exist yet because beer didn't exist yet. And so if you wanted to go to a big beer festival in the summer, you went to Toronto Festival of Beer. And it was a shit show because it was craft beer, but it was also like Coors and Budweiser and just like a lot of really wasted bros. And so when they asked me to work it, I was like, yeah, totally, I would love to. can I work can I work Cascapalooza? Because Great Lakes at the time had a fully separate section of the festival called Cascapalooza that was just a wall of casks. And I was like, that'll be less shitty. So, woman, beer festival, 2012. You gotta wear a spaghetti strap tank top. The breweries are all selling branded thongs at the time. Yeah, special. And the women working for craft breweries, like our spaghetti strap tank tops, like 1990s, like baby doll style, were like the most dressed anyone was at that festival. And so I show up there and I was like, what the fuck is happening? And then at the same time, there is a fire truck with go-go dancers on it as part of the festival, like right beside Cascapalooza. And so it's just like, guys, I was led to believe that craft beer was like a different world than mainstream beer. like it's different than I expected. However, and so at that point, I started looking for other women who were working in the industry or interested in beer, but not interested in what at the time was still like a very much in transition in terms of understanding of like women's role in beer and women's interest in beer. And so, yeah, so I started an all-female BJCP study group. So the BJCP is the Beer Judge Certification Program. And so I'm a beer judge. I've been judging since 2012. I prefer drinking beer to making it. My policy in brewing at Shortfinger is that I will only brew to make something that Rob refuses to brew.
So you and I can do the next one that's a collaboration then.
Yeah, you and I should brew together. It would be a way better fit. I make a mean British mild. We have a beer on tap periodically called Catherine the Mild. That is me. That is my beer. I wanted to drink it. Rob refused to make it. Here we are. So I got into beer judging, recruited a group of us. There was about 7 of us. And it was, women who were brewing at Mill Street and who were going to be brewing at the yet to be open Burdock. And we're working for Steam Whistle, brewing at Steam Whistle, and sort of like all over the map. And at the time, it was still like so novel that Paul Dickey, everybody's grandfather, like a skinny Santa Claus, is Canada's BJCP Grandmaster Judge. So he's like the highest rank you can get. He's the highest rank in the country. Single nicest man I've ever met in my life. Heard about us and was like, let me help you. You are unicorns. This is so exciting. Because there's so few women who were judging at the time. And even later, I ran a competition in 2016 that was an all-female homebrew competition. And it was a nationwide competition, and we still only got like 50 entries. And most of them were from a woman in Alberta named Marianne Scott, who's one of the most accomplished homebrewers in the country. But there just weren't a lot of women homebrewing, and there weren't a lot of women competing, and there weren't a lot of women going to meetings and talking about it. So it was kind of this weird, like, I would walk into a homebrew club meeting and expect everyone to be smoking cigars, basically. And like have elbow patches. And like, I have elbow patches, but I think that they would just think I was being ironic. So that was beer in Toronto. We did that for a while. It was fine. I kept teaching. I'm still teaching. One thing that we have learned is that, and this probably won't be a surprise to anyone here, you don't really make money in craft beer. People who have money will start craft breweries with that money. But if you don't have it to begin with, it doesn't tend to be like a massive money-making venture. And so I'm still teaching. I switched to a different school when we moved out here, so that one of us can consistently keep a roof over our heads. We did talk about moving into, there's like a second level above part of Shortfinger, and it's like the only section that's air conditioned. So we talked about moving in to the brewery for a while. the city wasn't going to let us rezone for that. And also, we already work too much. So if we lived there, I would just like never stop. So yeah, we got kind of disillusioned with things. We had sort of felt like we had run our course. We were never going to be able to afford to open anything in Toronto. And so we started looking around Ontario. We picked Kitchener-Waterloo because my background is in digital geography and GIS, and I made a map. I made a map with a lot of different overlays. And so we looked at the location of all the post-secondary institutions. We looked at income areas. We looked at population centers. We looked at location of independent schools because I teach in the independent system. We looked at level of education because there is a direct correlation, at least in the States, between level of education and participation in homebrewing as a hobby. And so we looked at all those things, and then we narrowed it down to Ottawa. All of our friends from post-secondary somehow moved to Ottawa, and we didn't really want to be part of that. We love them, but we like distance. Also, it gets really cold and really hot. So it was going to be Ottawa, it was going to be here, or it was going to be Kingston, and neither of us wanted to live anywhere near Queens. I'm sorry if you're offended if you went there and you love it, but we didn't want to be in that kind of a student center. So we picked here. I had been here twice in my life. One of those times was to look at houses. And so it was a weird move. It was a good move. As soon as we landed here, we started the homebrew shop out of our basement. So that was like a super sweet way to get to know people. True Grit, the homebrew club, hadn't started yet. It was in talks. It started the next summer. But there was a group called the Kitchener-Waterloo Craft Beer Club, and we found them on Facebook. And they're some of our best friends. And Mike, who's our homebrew store manager, that's how we met him. And it's just like a group of people that would get together sort of 3 times a year to like evaluate each other's homebrew, but really just like get loaded and then do a Google form about which one you liked the best. Which was like, it was fine by us. So we did that, and I got to know people that way. And then that was also, shortly after we moved here, that's also how I got involved in Queen of Craft, which, if you're not familiar with it, is the fundraising arm of Wellington Brewery. And so it's a group of Wellington employees, all women, who started a fundraising initiative to raise awareness for and money to put towards the Guelph Wellington Women in Crisis Network. And so they do events throughout the year, and they work with different organizations. Last summer, I spoke at the Dundas Museum about the history of women in brewing as part of a fundraiser they were doing there. But their main thing is that every Friday in March, they do an education series. That's all female speakers. I mean, guys are welcome. They don't really go very often. I've had Rob come to a room. I'm like, oh, really? Interesting. Remember all those times I told you that it was weird to be the only girl at a homebrew club meeting? Welcome. And so, yeah, so I've spoken at that a number of times. I've talked about the history of women in beer, hops, Belgian brewing, German brewing, a couple of other things. But it's great. They just basically reach out to people in the industry who care about beer and are interested in sharing that expertise. And all of the breweries donate their product, and all of the speakers donate their time, and all of the proceeds go to really rad causes. Last year, there was also a wrestling night, which was the coolest. Yeah, I see your face. I see you, David. And it was super rad. So they paired and they did it again at Wellington Cask Fest in the fall, but they paired every brewery with a different female professional wrestler. And so we all made a collaborative beer with that wrestler. And then we made either did photo shoots or promo videos. And then it was brewery against brewery and wrestler against wrestler. And we did it at the Red Chevron in Guelph. And there was this epic wrestling night. And it was the most fun because this was when Glow, I don't know if you know that show on Netflix, was huge. So all of the wrestlers went full Glow style with 80s hair and lycra and spandex and glitter. Shortfinger went stone cold Steve Austin. So we went the opposite end. So it was Renee Navarro, myself, and then our wrestler's name is Shiloh Polly, and it was hilarious. And so like that for me, moving out of Toronto and moving out here was like the best thing to reinvigorate why I like beer and what I care about in beer and what I am interested in a beer community and in an industry that I just felt like we weren't getting in quite the way I was hoping to in Toronto. That's all I got. I feel like I just talked for a long time.
Fascinating. I love how animated you are when it came to wrestling. Almost as much as David
so much
was.
Fun. I was not a big wrestling fan growing up.
So they're going to do that again, and you and I are going to do a collaborative beer because I want to get in on this for that.
Yeah, it's so much fun. And like that night, the energy of all the people in the red chevron, like all the audience, the people who came to just like watch wrestling, everybody got dressed up. People like made signs. It was like a whole. I've never been to WrestleMania, and I will probably not ever go. But I bet you this was more exciting than WrestleMania.
Of course it was. The energy in the air would have been unbelievable at that moment.
It was really rad.
Before you guys unmute to ask questions, did a couple of things. First of all, Kat, thank you for agreeing to come on and chat with me. I really love it. I have always had interesting conversations with you, even just in person. So thank you. Next week, Graham Spence, one of the founders of Blackberry Brewing and the Beer Garden in St. Jacobs, is joining me. Him and I will be doing a live stream tasting. And if you want to, is it up, David, on the site yet? We have the kickoff annex tasting pack that they've put together for us, and you can order it up until Friday and have it delivered before Tuesday.
That is super cool.
Yeah, it was something that I was eventually working towards, and he wanted to do it, and I'm like, okay, let's just do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tonight, by the way, I am drinking a short finger beer.
Ooh.
This is my last bottle from Christmas, the Cookie Tears that Rob and I did the collab on. It does not have any of the chocolate cookie in it. Sorry, you're absolutely right. I've got a lot of the sour and the malt in the background, but I'm enjoying it just the same because it's my last collaborative beer. It might be my last one I've ever done with Rob, come to think of it, now that you're going to do them with you now.
I'm in. Except there's no way Rob's going to give up on collaborating with you. Even though he like complains that it's all stuff he would never make, he's not going to let me take that job.
Are you sure?
I'm pretty sure. I think he really likes it.
Okay. See what happens. But we are definitely doing one for the wrestling.
Yeah, 100%. Game on.
Yeah, I really love that. So please unmute yourself, raise your hand if you want to talk. I notice there's a bunch of stuff going on in chat. I never pay any attention to it because I'm an old guy. I'll let David watch it. He'll have to wave at me sometime.
I like Graham's comment of Supreme Court beer judge. That's like the next level above Grandmaster, I guess.
They never tell you about those career paths when you're in high school, and you feel like you missed out, honestly. Like, what the hell?
Yeah, man, except beer judging, you don't get paid for it. It's all volunteer.
Yeah, but is it like...
You get to drink all the beer you want, even bad beer.
Then what are we talking about?
So that's the problem. You do drink a lot of beer. However, there is no guarantee that all that beer is good. There's also no guarantee that the judging conditions are great. So the BJCP it's true. So the BJCP recommends that you keep your flights below 10 whenever possible so that you're never judging more than 10 beers at a time. And you're only having a couple of ounces of each beer. So it's not like you're drinking a ton.
Right.
But the intention is to like prevent palate fatigue. Bigger competitions can't always do that. So there was one, I'm not going to get too, okay, it's going to be really obvious, but I'm just not going to say it. So like a very large commercial competition that happens nationwide in Canada is some of the worst judging environment I've ever been in, because the first year that I judged it, I was given a flight of 21 Imperial Stouts.
Your palate's gone after 5.
Yeah, a friend of mine, and so I judged 3 flights that year. I didn't go back. This is the first year I haven't judged at that competition, and a friend of mine who did judge, he judged 5 sessions, and in those 5 sessions, he had 135 beers. It's too much.
At something like that,
at that point.
when you had the 22 Imperial Stouts, did you have to judge other types of beer also, like later, or?
So I, thankfully, that session didn't. Most organizers, not all, but most organizers will try and do it so that if there are multiple sessions in a day, and for large competitions, there usually are. So I'll give you an example. Brew Slam is the largest homebrew competition in Canada. It's also one of the best run competitions I've ever judged at. They have 3 or 4 sessions in a day. But Eric, the organizer, will always make sure that the bigger beers, whether that's bigger in terms of alcohol, in terms of palate killers, right? Like, you know, you're not going to want to do your double IPAs at 8 a.m. You're not going to want to do your barley wines at 8 a.m. So he'll put those at the end of the day, because otherwise he'll know that his judges, their palates are going to be screwed, and they're not going to, nobody's going to judge barley wine and then go to Pilsner.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Right? So most organizers will try and set it up so that if there's multiple flights in a day and the same people judging, they'll put them on the easiest flight to judge in terms of alcohol level and subtlety of flavors first, and not easy in terms of those are easy to judge. Pilsners are really hard to judge, but they're easy on your palate. They're easy on you to drink, to have a bunch of, and then they'll put the harder stuff later in the day. Hi, tiny human.
So Kat, since no one else has a question, when we were talking last night, we were talking about the difference between being in Toronto and being in the outlying regions.
I knew you were going to ask me that, you jerk.
You didn't tell me not to.
I know I didn't. Yeah, so I feel better saying it because you told me I'm not the only person who's told you this before. Although I don't know if Tomas is the one I should be judging against. So yeah, one of the things that I found, and that we were sort of expecting to find, but definitely did, we had a really great community of people working in beer. In Toronto, we were part of a homebrew club called the Swansea Homebrew Club that was all professional brewers. So it was, you know, the brewers from Amsterdam and Steam Whistle, and at the time Nickelbrook, now he's the head of Collective, Great Lakes, etc. So it was like this super stacked homebrew club, and they were great. And it was great when you were just hanging out with those people, but as soon as you went to any event, and like, this might not come as a shock to some of you, the Toronto beer scene, compared to smaller centers, is pretty pretentious. And
Toronto's pretentious? Whoa, shocked.
What? And I say this as somebody who, like, I lived in Toronto for years. I love it. It's a great city. There are great people there. There is wonderful beer there. The culture itself, though, both in terms of the way breweries feel the need to present to themselves or present to others at public events, and the way people engage with each other at public events, and just like the level of, I don't want to say pomp and circumstance because it's like just beer, but still, I found Toronto, and I didn't really realize what it was until we left, but the beer culture there was, like, I think the word is comparatively pretentious. And then getting out of town and going to some small centers, like, you're never going to walk into Sawdust City and be like, man, people here are douchebags. Like, you know, like, and that kind of pretension, it doesn't exist there. And same thing, like you're not gonna walk into Block 3 and talk to Graham or Kevin and be like, man, they were really snobby. And I felt like I needed to know more, or I felt like they thought I didn't know enough about what I was drinking. And so I really did find in Toronto, and Rob and I have talked about it, he found it a bit, but not as much. I really found in Toronto that like, in order to talk about beer, I had to have credentials to talk about beer. And so I immediately became a beer judge, and I immediately did all my Prud'homme levels, and I immediately started training for Cicerone, because then it was like, when people would give me that look, I'd be like, oh no, really? Like I have things, like I have pieces of paper and I have credentials and I know what I'm saying. Whereas like out here, nobody cares. It's just like, oh, you like beer? I like beer. Do you want to talk about it for a while? And it's just like, it's just different and it's lower key. And for me, I just like it better.
That's fair. That's fair. I mean, I've traveled around the world, and there's the capital of the country, and then there's the rest of the country. Toronto is the center of the universe.
Toronto is not the capital of our country, my friend.
I know, but it's the center of the universe for Ontario.
Yeah, it's true.
Because Ottawa's too cold to be the center.
It's also out
It's
in the
so far
boondocks.
away. Yeah.
There. Cat. Man, I missed you. I'm having like deep flashbacks to you and I like really bonding during the 2019 election at kickoff.
Oh man, election night.
That was a great night.
I love elections. They're like my Olympics.
Kat, I actually do have a question. So I've like been following Queen of Craft a little bit online for just a while now, and I think partially just because I might have a couple people that are involved with it, but like a little bit more about that organization. I know it is run through Wellington, but does it grab sort of a lot from like, is it just what I sort of call like the Quad City area, like Guelph and then KW Cambridge, or is it like wider?
So in terms of their year-round ongoing stuff, it's more or less just, Quad City, Waterloo, Wellington focused. You know, occasionally you'll have people from like the far reaches of like Alora, you know, like Jenna will do stuff year round.
Oh,
but really it's the area. March is a game changer. They'll bring people in from all over the province, just based on whatever topics and things they're planning on talking about. And so March is kind of the exception to the rule. You'll see people from a little bit further afield, but year round it's Wellington. It's kind of like that's who's doing it, and then the rest of us just kind of like help out when they need us, or when there's a topic that they kind of think that we would be the best one to talk about. So then they'll reach out kind of in that way. But yeah, so it just kind of depends on the time of the year, but mostly you're right. Mostly it's, I've never heard Quad City before. I really like it.
I went to high school in Guelph and then I came here. And so whenever I talk about this area, and like Guelph and KW are kind of connected, I'm just like, I try to group it.
Well, they do have that Highway 7 that connects them.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that one laner that I always get stuck behind the guy going 55. Oh yeah, I love that thing. The investment area for the tech group calls it the Golden Triangle, and I refuse to ever call it that. So just, you know, for reference, Quad City is at least less weird.
Oh man, Golden Triangle kind of makes it sound like there might be aliens involved, which I'm sort of into.
Oh, okay. I'm picking up what you're putting down. Okay. Well, I've been to Cambridge. There's lots of people that act like aliens.
No. You've got to get to Hessler.
True. Fair point.
Okay.
Do you?
No.
Also good point. Kat, maybe just quick follow-up. So you mentioned kind of the pretentiousness, and maybe we're kind of skirting around it, but one thing I'd be interested in is like, I feel like if I was to ask the question is like, is there misogyny in the beer industry? I would get a big fat doy. potentially. But one thing I'd like to know is do you notice a difference between how maybe this area is versus Toronto? Being a woman.
I guess, yeah, so it's kind of a two-parter. Actually, it could be a many-parter, but yes, in a couple of ways, but also I'm really cognizant of the passage in time. In Ontario, the role and perceived place of women in beer has changed considerably since I started working with Great Lakes in 2011 or 2012. So that's kind of the first thing, right? I've been living here since 2015. So I recognize that passage of time is significant. I also recognize that when I left Toronto, a Society of Beer Drinking Ladies was just getting started. A couple of the women who were in my BJCP group went on to start that with Ren and a couple of other ladies. And so there wasn't really, even in Toronto at the time, like a voice or a place. But then I moved out here. Queen of Craft had already been rolling for a couple of years at that point. And it really depends on the brewery. Wellington has a fantastic ratio of men and women working there. They are also more, I mean, not that it takes much in Ontario, and this is a bigger issue, but they're also more racially diverse than most breweries in the province and certainly in the region. But there's still a lot of breweries, even Shortfinger, and I'm one of the founders. Day in and day out, when you go to Shortfinger, you see three people. You see Rob, straight white guy. You see Mike, straight white guy. And you see Stuart, slightly younger, straight white guy.
And occasionally you see a crusty old guy called Bill there.
Old
white guy.
Occasionally you see Bill. Right? And I'm still teaching, so I'm only there evenings and weekends. And so even though I'm one of the people who started this thing, I'm still not visibly that involved. And that is still the face of most Ontario breweries, particularly most smaller Ontario breweries. There are more so now than there were, even 5 or 10 years ago, women opening breweries in Ontario, right? Erin Broadfoot, who's also a fantastic BJCP judge, opened Little Beasts. And so that's one woman-owned brewery where she is also the head brewer. And so that's one that's 100% worth checking out, right? And so you are kind of seeing that changing, but I don't know, just because I've been here for 5 years and beer has changed so much in 5 years that from my perspective, yeah, it's way more accepting here, right? When True Grist started, Justin Angivar, who's the president of the club, approached me because I was the only woman to go to the first 3 meetings. And he was like, hey, can we talk about how to make this a more welcoming place for women? And I was like, cool. You know who would never ask me that when I was in Toronto? Anybody from GTA Brews. So, so I do think that this area for sure is a little bit different, but I also I cannot say enough, time has passed, things have changed across the board. And so my perspective is only based on the fact that my last 5 years have been here and I have seen more progress in that time.
Okay, cool.
And in fairness, there's been more progress across the board.
Yeah, exactly.
15 years ago, you would have rarely seen any female coming into the bar as a rep for a beer company, whereas now it's a much higher proportion.
Yeah, absolutely.
We still have a ways to go.
Absolutely. But I mean, even if you looked at the difference in, the difference in the graduating class of the first cohort out of Niagara College and their brewing and brewing management program and what the classes look like now, is it still predominantly male? Yeah. Is there a way better ratio comparatively? Absolutely.
Cool.
Hey, I mean, I know this is a beer meetup, but the parallels for all of these conversations with tech are intense. The same deal with pretentiousness, the same thing with diversity. It's neck and neck.
Yeah. I think that that's a really good point. And I know Bill said he was rescheduling Ren to come back another time. And if you're here the week that she comes, in addition to, I mean, she mostly looks at diversity in beer, but I know she's also worked with tech companies and engineering firms, because those are two other areas where it's like, you just have the same conversation.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. But then all you had to do, take a look at the graduating engineering classes. And you go back 20 years, the number of females in the class, disproportionately tiny compared to the number of men. And it's significantly changed. But I can tell you from a point of view of what those girls face every time they go out on a work term hasn't changed in 15 years, unfortunately, because they're still dealing with my generation and the next one underneath.
Yeah, Mike, our store manager, his wife Paula is an engineer. And yeah, she's
Yeah. Yeah. The one girl could, I don't know what to tell you about my work term. They did let me make coffee.
Oh.
Yeah.
I told one of the co-ops that we had when I was with my last tech company, I was like, hey, you had a really good work time. I'm really glad you got to work here. And she broke down crying because she had such a rough placement the last time before. She was like, I have never like, and that's not to like prop up my last place. Every place has problems, but like, it was just shocking. Like, she was like, I was like, had a really tough time, and everyone here was really cool. Like 99% of the time, like, and it's just shocking. Like, how much work still needs to be done on the engineering side. Not to like really dive into, engineers have problems with misogyny, but yeah.
But it's the same conversation, right? Like, it is not possible to underscore enough how much it matters when people just aren't shitty to each other. Like,
yeah,
that's the point. If there are people in your workplace, doesn't matter who they are, don't be shitty to them. Right? People are more productive, they are happier, therefore you can be more productive and you are happier. And I'm like, this is not rocket science, and yet 2020.
And we're still having the conversation.
Yeah.
I have a question. Why is it that brewing is in the classification of cooking or chef, yet in the bakeries and cooking and chefing world, it's not as bad, or is it as bad?
I am terrible at both cooking and baking, so I don't know a ton about those worlds. But I can tell you, because I am a teacher librarian and I approach all things academically, that baking, as it stands, still mostly like female dominated, is not generally as lucrative. So individual bakers, sure. Do you make amazing cakes? Maybe you're gonna make a bunch of great money, whatever. But in terms of like public perception and the size of the industry, it doesn't have the same, you don't get the same accolades. It's not as much of a giant industry as beer certainly has become. Beer from the very early days was done by women as part of their household tasks. It was akin to cooking and baking. And it was that way in every culture that was a brewing culture until trade entered the scene. And when trade entered the scene and money was changing hands, women got kicked out of brewing so that men could make the money from the trade. The exception to that for a long time was England. And in England, women were allowed to stay in the brew house for longer if they were widowed or single. And then the plague happened, the Black Death. And then after the plague, because basically it was just like the Wild West, somewhat akin to changes in the brewing industry in Ontario right now. People realized that they could start bigger breweries. There were fewer people who could brew, who had money to brew, and therefore suddenly the supply and demand got different. And that was when the shift in England happened. So it was a little bit later, but it was still the same idea of like, as soon as it was something that you could really make money on, women got kicked out of the brew house. In England, the excuse was essentially like Christianity. It became perceived as brewing was unchristian for women to do. That was also where the idea of women as witches came from initially. The cauldron is a brew kettle. And the broomstick actually originally is an adaptation of your brewing paddle, or your mash paddle. And so, you know, why that happened with beer and it didn't happen with baking, I think people are willing to spend more money to get drunk than they are on bread. And I think where the money is, that's where the men are.
Yeah. And in the world of chefs, it's the same kind of dialogue. The minute that it became a profession, it became male dominated, and it still is male dominated to a great extent.
You know, and essentially anything that requires, traditionally anything that requires either a higher level of education became male dominated, engineering, tech, medicine, or where you could make a lot of money even if you didn't have an education, beer. Oh look, dudes.
I love it.
Not to steer away from the existentialism that this path is going down, but I do want to create it back slightly. I do like existential stuff, but I'm also aware of what this live stream is supposed to be a little bit.
We're talking about beer, David.
I know.
That makes one of us. Continue.
So I think you, especially having been in the industry, might have a really good perspective on what are your thoughts on how the local beer community and the brewery scene has evolved over the last 5 years?
Yeah, it's been crazy. So within the last 5 years, so when we came here, I mean, Wellington's been open for ages, right? But, and at the time, you know, Stonehammer was still a thing. Innocente was open and Block 3 was open. And since then, everyone that I haven't mentioned has opened. And so it's absolutely exploded. And it's been a combination of kind of like different groups of people starting things, which has been really neat, right? Like TWB was already in the works before we moved here. They just were not able to find a space for a long time. And so they were delayed in actually getting started. But they'd been planning for a couple of years by the time we came. And so you have, you know, you've got those guys running the co-op on we like to call it the wrong side of the tracks because they're across the train tracks from us. But they call our side the wrong side, so I don't know. You've got that. You've got, you know, like more recently, Counterpoint is making fantastic beers. Graham and Rich are like two of our earlier customers who were, you know, like homebrewers in the area and decided to go pro and are doing fantastic things because of it. I would say the industry works really well together locally, with exceptions, right? Like there are different personalities and not everybody gets along all the time. But for the most part, we all play nice. There's a group of us, 4 breweries in the region are working on a collaboration right now.
Cool.
Right? And so, you know, things are going pretty well in that regard. And there's always kind of new faces coming in. Some of the people who've started breweries are from the region and have roots in the region. And it was just kind of the next logical step. Some people were more like us, who we weren't from the region originally. You know, like Rob's family's in Listowel, but like, that's not here. 40 minutes doesn't count. And so, you know, there's also that, like there's people coming from Toronto or coming from other areas to start things off. So then you kind of have a different community there, right? Like I know when Rhythm and Brews was first starting, Andrew was still commuting back to Toronto. Wow. And so, you know, and like right now with Reverence, Matt's living back in Toronto during the pandemic. And so he's doing, you know, deliveries like way wider range than most places, especially for a teeny tiny Cambridge brewery, but it's where he's living. So it makes sense. So there's still kind of like, there's a bit of that too. And I think it's the same with a lot of industries, right? Like this is just on the edge of where people can commute. And so even in beer, there are people who are like commuting from far afield to be working in beer.
Cool.
But yeah.
Is there anything like
Most people aren't jerks.
that's good? I think I know the one that you're talking about. That's jerk-ish.
I didn't say there was one.
Fair point.
David, stop.
Oh, is there
Like
anything?
every big happy family, there's one really black sheep.
The weird uncle.
Yeah.
So I'm the weird uncle in my family, so I'll ask a question. The perception about how many breweries we can support. So we've had this explosion in the 5 years you've been here. Like Cambridge has like what, 7 alone now or something.
Yeah.
Is there a limit to this, or is there a cull coming or a drop? And then let's put the pandemic aside if that's possible, right? I'm not sure. It's obviously going to have a negative effect, but do you think there's more space for more breweries?
Yeah, it's going to have an effect for sure. I think the answer to that, you can look on different scales, right? You can look within communities, and you can look at individual communities in the United States, for example, that support just as many, if not small breweries, and are doing fine. You can also look at towns where that hasn't worked. If we look at the explosion, not just in the region, but in Ontario, yeah, we're absolutely reaching a critical mass. Ontario's population is not growing that quickly. And so in order for it to be sustainable, for breweries to be opening at the rate that they have been, we're gonna have to get more beer drinkers or more people switching from macro brands and imports to locally produced beer. And it is already the case that you're starting to see some breweries close their doors. I don't think, I mean, like, knock on all the things. Pandemic aside, I don't think that you're necessarily going to see like a massive, like, oh crap, we've overexerted ourselves and a ton of breweries close. One thing that you've kind of started to see, and I think we're going to start seeing more of, is breweries that don't make good beer not surviving. I think that both in terms of the number of breweries in Ontario, but also the expectations of Ontario beer drinkers based on the improvement in quality that's happened over the last 5-10 years. I think you have more critical consumption of beer happening in the province. And so that, coupled with the fact that there are more breweries to choose from, essentially means that breweries are going to have to, like, shape up or ship out if they're not making a good product.
Follow up to that is, I have no idea what the law, I know they're complicated in Ontario specifically, but is there any chance that we could start to see some microbrews starting to like do takeovers or like mergers or like anything kind of like that? I know there's a lot of like working together, but is there any stuff like that that could ever happen, or is that not a thing?
No, that could, it could happen. The main obstacle to that is probably the thing that I said at the beginning of, like, you don't really make a ton of money making beer.
Right.
And so unless you are independently wealthy and happen to own a craft brewery and decide that you want to take over another one, just financially, it's not super likely that you're going to start seeing that happen just between like small breweries in the province. It's more likely that you'll start seeing, like we've seen in the States, bigger conglomerates coming in and trying to scoop up some of our better known craft breweries.
Right.
I had heard that Railway City was investing in a bunch of the smaller breweries to help prevent that. Do you know much about that?
I don't. I don't know much about that at all. If anyone here does, have at. But I do know that there is definitely a push and an interest and a lot of discussions happening in Ontario about like avoiding the sellout. But ultimately, that's been the case all over the place, right? Like, there's been conversations for years in breweries that have sworn up and down in the States, for example, that they would never sell out. And ultimately, if you decide you want to retire, or if you need an influx of cash, or if you realize that brewing is backbreaking work and you don't want to do it anymore, that like there are breweries that ultimately make the decision to sell. And sometimes it goes well and sometimes it doesn't. But no, specifically the Railway City thing, I find that really interesting, but I don't know anything about it.
So Sean, I'm not totally familiar with what went on with Railway City, but I do know that he understood the very principle of marketing, and that is the more quality people you have in a market, the more market share everybody gets. And so I do know that there was money invested in startups, but I don't believe that wasn't making sure that people weren't bought out. I think it was more making sure that if he had competition, it was quality competition. It wasn't.
The whole market improves.
Yeah.
From the competition. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which makes sense, right? Like that's something that Rob and I have talked about, because we are, if you're coming west of Toronto and you are interested in sour beer and mixed fermentation, you've got us, you've got half hours on Earth. Is Seaforth close by? No. Is it close enough that if when a lot of the people when they leave Toronto, they're like, oh my God, going anywhere is so far. But once you get them past the edge limits of the GTA, they seem to be willing to keep going. So for a long time, it was us and it was half hours. And it was like, okay, but there's still an hour between us. So that's not really close. So now Matt's opened Reverence in Cambridge. Well, he specializes in barrel-aged sours. And so for us, he's a friend of ours, full disclosure, he's our dungeon master in Dungeons and Dragons. So Matt's our DM, and he opened a sour brewery that's, 20 minutes from ours. Is that something that we're stressed out about? No, it's freaking awesome, because people that are interested in mixed fermentation beer are willing to travel for it. And to be able to come and hit a couple breweries that are doing it and hopefully both doing it really well, it's worthwhile, right? So that idea of making sure that people in your community are doing it right is really important. And likewise, when there's people here from out of town, if they come to Shortfinger and ask what other breweries they should hit up, we have a list of breweries that we will recommend. It's not every brewery in town. It's the ones that we are confident that every time we go in, we'll have a good pint.
Yeah. But the more people you have doing anything in a region, the more you attract outside tourism.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's why Bill sends everybody to Molly's.
That's right, I did. You'd be much happier at Molly's than you would be here.
Well played. That's also why the Guelph beer bus is the smartest thing in the world.
Yeah.
Right? Last summer, all the Guelph breweries got together. They, Guelph bus system let them rent a bus for the day, and they had a loop going brewery to brewery. And you could just go for free and get dropped off at all the breweries and do a brewery crawl. And it was genius. People were coming from Toronto to get on the Guelph beer bus and go try all of Guelph's breweries, because you can. Right? It's so smart.
Do it here.
Yeah.
We tried to do it here. Grand River Transit will not rent buses. They will also not let you hire a driver for the day. We did try last summer. So we got together last summer. We were in conversation. We were trying to organize it, coordinate it with Block 3 as a starting point. And so because we wanted it to be KW, but also up to St. Jacobs to hit them. Because particularly if you're coming from out of town and you want to see this touristy region, everyone wants to go to St. Jacobs. It's adorable. So we wanted the loop to be St. Jacobs, and we reached out to Grand River Transit, and they
hard no.
And we sent them the links to what they were doing in Guelph, and they were basically like, oh, Guelph, those hippies, we're not doing that.
How far did you get, Kat? Do you know who you talked to?
Names? No. Graham sent an email, and then I probably still have the email chain, Terry, of who sent back saying no, and then they gave us a number to call, and then I called and they also said no.
Do you have any appetite to pursue it again?
Do I have any, sorry?
Appetite to re-pursue this?
I mean, probably not this summer because there's a pandemic.
Well, yeah.
But yeah, in the future, absolutely, because on it, it is a genius idea and also just so much fun.
Right, and it demonstrates.
Guelph did it, and Guelph did it well.
Yeah, Guelph did
it.
Except
for
the things was not fun.
Well,
and we can not do it.
So if you have an appetite, to pursue it again outside of a pandemic, right? Because it's nice to be on a full bus full of drunks as opposed to only limited to 10 people or something. Let me know and we'll re-pursue it again next summer because
Perfect.
I can at least get it in front of the people that run transit. You may not have gotten past people that wanted to buy. They were.
And that's honestly, that's probably what it was. Because the answer is yes, we 100% still want to pursue it. Yeah, and it was maybe just that we found the wrong people, right? Like in Guelph, it's super easy. You can literally go on their transit site and there's like a button to click to rent a bus.
Right.
Like it's just like, it's public and anyone can do it. You can hire a bus and a driver. And so, you know, like we were like, well, that doesn't seem to exist here. So we just started the conversation from there. And so when we got shut down, we were like, oh, well, Waterloo region, what you gonna do?
Oh my God, somebody wants to rent a bus.
Right?
You can literally rent one of those old legacy TTC streetcars for a day if you want to here.
That's really cool. Yeah, and so we actually, because when we couldn't rent a bus, we looked at renting a coach, prohibitively expensive, and also just like a very different ball game, I think. And we looked at, and then it was like, oh, well, we could rent a school bus, but like nobody wants to be on a yellow school bus in July with a bunch of sweaty drunk people.
I did that for a company event for like 20 minutes and everyone on the bus was like, we're going to die back here.
Yeah, because it's terrible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or even if they didn't want to rent you a bus, they could market. So when LRT opened and it was free, Emma did a 2-day long weekend LRT pub crawl. We went to some pretty terrible bars, right? Because when you get to Fairway Road, there's like nothing to drink down there.
Well, didn't you guys go to the closest place to every stop?
We tried, and we got to a lot of places, and we
You were on the list.
You guys were on the list.
You were highlighted.
But it was like, what's the horrible bar on Fairway Road where we ended up? Foxy's was the closest place to get a beer, and we couldn't get out of there fast enough. And they had no idea what we were doing either.
Well, and see, that's the thing, right? Like the LRT theoretically is great, but there's actually, in terms of like supporting the breweries, there's not very many breweries along the LRT or close to the LRT. And so we were having, and so, you know, like we were talking about like, obviously Counterpoint needs to be involved. Well, they're not on the LRT.
Yeah.
Right. And so, you know, we were organizing it with Block 3. The LRT does not go to St. Jacobs. Right. So it's also just like, it's that piece of trying to balance. And that's why we thought the bus was the right answer. Because then you can just kind of make your own route and go wherever you want.
We'll take a crack at it again.
Thanks, Harry.
If you're interested.
We are. Right?
We can nudge Graham next week when he's on.
Perfect. Well, no, Graham was the one spearheading
Graham
it.
wants
Like
to do it. Yeah.
Graham was the one like writing the emails, making the calls. Like he wants it to happen.
That's what I'm saying. We'll give him a nudge next week when I'm
It
sure.
was just a weird
Yeah.
stonewall from the city. Like,
That's okay.
really?
Terry has an axe to get us through the wall a little bit.
Yeah.
Get through the wall.
He doesn't. But anyway, mute. He can be convincing, but yeah.
I want to really quick build off of David's question. He talked about takeover brewing and just stuff of that. Contract breweries did explode at some point around Toronto, like in the early 2010s. What do you think about that business model?
I think it's shitty. I think sorry. I will sometimes be diplomatic. I will sometimes be diplomatic, and then you know.
Thanks,
I think it's a shitty
now I have to
business
make
model.
this an explicitly labeled podcast.
Sorry.
Please.
I didn't even think about that. Was I not supposed to swear? Sorry, David. You can.
No, I honestly don't care. I was always going to make this explicit. It's me and Bill. Like, holy shit.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah, so I would say, what were we talking about?
Contract brewing.
Oh, contract brewing. Oh, yeah, it's the worst.
Contract brewing in the city there.
So contract brewing makes sense if you are on the road to starting a brewery and you do not yet have a licensed brew house. Contract brewing is a good stopgap for that. If you want to start getting your name out there and your brand out there and your liquid out there, contract brewing makes sense in that capacity. So I will give you a very good example. Friends of ours who make fantastic beer, started Matron Fine Beer in Prince Edward County. The county, and I know because Rob's family lives out there, is very slow to deal with. And then add to that the AGCO, not known for being expedient. Add to that the fact that they bought a janky old farmhouse that needed a ton of renovations to be able to accommodate a brewery. While they were doing all of that, they did some contract brewing so that they could start developing their core recipes or scaling them up. They already had them. Start scaling up their core recipes, getting their brand out there, getting their beer into people's hands through licensees. Short-term solution, worked really well while they were getting their own space licensed and ready to go. That I have a lot of respect for. I don't understand contract brewing forever. To me, you are not a brewery, you are a branding machine because you have someone else doing all of your brewing for you. Most places that are doing contract brewing, you know, if you think about like Equals in London, all they do is contract for other people, right? They don't, oh, Pratt. Yeah, so one of my favorite people brews at Equals in London, but they don't make their own beer. They only make other people's brands. And so if you are forever selling your beer to Pratt to make, then I'm sorry, that's his beer. That is not your beer. You do not have a brewery, you have a brand.
Like
And
the sports one, the golf beer and the skiing beer and all that quality stuff.
Triple bogey.
Triple bogey, yeah, and hurry hard. So fun fact, triple bogey originally was Great Lakes Golden Horseshoe. And so when they pulled Golden Horseshoe from the roster, because they were contracting for other people, that's where that recipe went. And so again, like, is that really a brewery that's doing that? Well, no, they're brewing a Great Lakes beer and sticking another label on it, but Great Lakes is also the one actually brewing it. And so as like a long-term, I think it's shitty. I think it's cheap. I don't like it. But also I say that as someone who like recognizes, you know, that running a brewery is hard and it's really rewarding, but also like it's messy and it's expensive and it's frustrating and sometimes it keeps you up at night. And so to be like, oh yeah, I own this great brewery, but like you don't have a brewery, you don't know how to make your own beer, you're a marketing company. To me, that's not craft.
So how about coming in from the other point of view, wherein I'm a brewery that's having issues or struggles right now, and I'm going to become a contract brewer for other companies.
Yeah, and there, I mean, a number of large breweries, larger craft breweries in Ontario do that. They contract. You have empty tanks and someone else can fill them? Sure. There's no risk ultimately, really, publicly to the brewery that's doing the contracting, right? If you're also making your own beer and you also have your own brand and this is helping you with cash flow, this is helping you keep beer in the tank, this is helping money come in your door when maybe, you know, you've just scaled up and you don't need the capacity you have yet, then I think contracting makes a lot of sense.
Maybe it's
right?
just about transparency, right? If you
Yes.
admit I'm a marketing company and I'm happy being a marketing company and I
Then
sell
it's
my,
fine.
then just refer to yourself as that as opposed to showing up at a festival and pretending to be a craft brewer. But yeah, the examples of the other scenario, I have capacity. It's sawdust out of black oak, right? Mark and Mandy brewing at Grand River and making better beer than they were making, right?
Which was the best thing that happened to Grand River because they picked up their
Exactly.
bootstraps.
Once we found out that 643 double IPA come out of Grand River, the bullshit about we can't brew hoppy beer here because of the water, we were all up and down Rob Crichton and like, that's nonsense, right?
That's
a
a lie.
ridiculously good double IPA. And
Yeah.
then there's another evolution. We talked, Grand River is a little bit of a story in itself. They were here when you got here, took a serious dive, hired a pretty decent brewer, bought by Magnata, but I haven't had a Grand River beer in 2 years, so I can't really tell you.
No, I haven't had a Grand River beer since Peter went to TWB.
Right.
Magnata now.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, really, City Board is there now. And
Yeah,
you guys-
but I will say, Terry, your comment made me think of something, because you're right. And left field's a great example. You can go into a contract brewery and you can give your recipe and brew the beer. And if you are involved, like they were, you can
Right, I
make
think
sure
they were
that-
actually coming on site and brewing. They were the
Exactly.
brewers. They were the ones
Exactly.
with their hands dirty.
Yeah, and so in a lot of cases, both when you're talking about places like Equals, where all they do is contract, or you're talking about breweries like, well, I mean, like lots of people do it, right? Like Great Lakes has done contracting in the past. Wellington did contracting when they expanded, right? Like it's pretty common. But the thing is, I think the onus is really on the brewery who needs their beer made to own that process and be part of that process, right? If you are a brewer and you need to contract space, you need to borrow someone's system and their tanks, then you got to be involved in that, because otherwise it's really easy for recipes to get changed unintentionally, right? Every brewer has a slightly different process. Every brewer has slightly different habits. And every brewer can make the same beer. And actually the best way to think of it is the altogether beers that were just made. Every version of that is a little bit different. And so if you give your recipe to somebody else to make for you, then you've basically given up ownership of what that product's going to be. And I think that's the biggest risk of contracting if you're not being really involved in that process.
What role does the brewmaster play in the quality of the production?
The brewmaster or the brewer?
It's a brewer.
I don't know the terminology, but whoever's brewing the cook.
Yeah. So there's the people that are like, that get the brewmaster title at the brewery, who may or may not be classically trained brewmasters. They tend to oversee brewing, but often are less involved in the actual day-to-day. The brewer is critically important. It doesn't matter how good the recipe is. If the person producing it isn't doing their due diligence in terms of, you know, everything from like measuring things, checking temperatures, cleaning and sanitizing. Most of the off flavors I've had in Ontario are because of infection or contamination somewhere along the line. And all of that is related to either the brewer, singular in a small brewery, or the brewing staff in a bigger place. But in all of those cases, the recipe, you know, like you can hand me a recipe for a really great meal and it's gonna turn out okay, because I'm not a great cook. But if you hand a great cook the same recipe, that's gonna be a phenomenal meal.
I think that's the key is, that's true in a lot of other industries. I was in the paint industry, and one body shop painter, he can make a paint job great or terrible. The good ones, you follow the good ones. It doesn't matter the environment, doesn't matter their tools, it doesn't matter the recipe, they'll do a good job. So what you're saying is the key role of the brewer following a process or creating a process. What would you say is it first?
Great question. I think on the basic level, following a process in terms of there are steps that need to be done in the correct order at roughly the same time every time, in terms of like when things happen and what temperatures they happen and how long they happen for, both on brew day and also in terms of like fermentation. But I do think that every brewery creates their own version of that process, and every brewer has a version of that process. And so you'll often talk to breweries, you know, some breweries want to hire, if you're hiring for like your head brewer position, right? You are going to hire someone who has industry experience, who is really confident and competent in what they're doing. So, you know, when Alora hired Dave from Wellington, they hired him to be their head brewer. They needed to pick somebody who knew what he was doing, who was confident, who had already come up with his processes, who was ready to rock. If you're hiring someone to help with production, most breweries will actually prefer to hire less experienced brewers. Much in the same way as a lot of the trades look at apprenticeships. So that you can essentially Like, teach them your ways without them having what you see as bad habits, which might actually just be different processes.
I'm just laughing. You never want to hire someone else's bad habits.
You don't want to hire someone else's bad habits. And you have your own, and you may or may not be aware of them, but you don't want somebody else's to be like added to yours, right? And so a lot of places, when they're hiring brewers, a lot of the people working in this industry, and I mean, it's changing a bit because you do have, right, Niagara's programs. We have a really good program in the province, but a lot of people that are working in beer are starting as, you know, cellarmen. They're managing just the yeast, and then they're working their way up, and then they're doing some production, and then they're doing production a little bit more independently, or maybe on a larger scale. And that, so it tends to be that you see people stay and work up the ladder somewhere, so that, because in that sense, like, you know that they have the habits that you want them to have, good or bad.
Yeah.
The question I had, going back to kind of the contract thing, maybe a parallel. Are you aware of any brewers that have kind of gotten together and decided to share a system? So say they're members of the same homebrew club and they both decide they want to go commercial, but they kind of go in on the capital together to get, you know, they buy the system, and maybe half the week one brewer uses it, half the week the other brewer uses it, and to make their own kind of recipe.
I haven't, and the only reason that I think that that's not really a thing in Ontario is licensing and legality. It is a different license to be a contract brewery than it is to run a commercial brewery. If you are a commercial brewery, your brew system must be on site in order for you to be able to sell that beer on site. So when you're contracting, you can't have a retail store and you can't have a tap room. All you can do is sell to the LCBO, you can sell to restaurants, you can sell to bars, which right now is last two.
I was just thinking, if you have kind of two full-fledged breweries operating on the same site but sharing equipment.
You can't have two breweries licensed on the same site in Ontario.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, and that's it. It's just not legal. They've made it so that each brewery needs their own system and their own site. And that's mostly for tracking and for taxation for volumes. I think they just figure it's easier that way.
Cool.
Kat, thank you for joining us today. Insightful conversation.
That was fun.
Absolutely enjoyed it. We'll have to do this again
sometime.
sometime.
I explore so much.
Oh, nowhere near the level that I've heard in other situations. Not from you, but in other situations.
I thought that's what you meant. And they were like, oh, you've sworn way more in the past.
Well, that day at the brewery where I made that mistake. No, I'm just kidding.
That would have been Rob swearing, not me.
Yes, I know. I know. Anyways, thank you for joining me. Thank you all for joining me. Remind you that Graham Spence from Block 3 is joining us next week, and we're doing a live tasting. And please check on the Kickoff Annex website for the information on ordering the tasting pack from Block 3 by Friday. Anyways, have a good night, everybody. Thank you.
Yep. See you, everyone.